So this presentation is focused on Peace Movement Aotearoa's views on the developing aerospace industry, and will outline our peace, disarmament and related concerns in relation to New Zealand government policy. Why is it not going down? Cool, righty ho. So to start with, let's look at what the aerospace sector includes. It's not only about Rocket Lab, which it appears some people, maybe not here, appear to think. So it ranges from low altitude drones and helicopters to increasing sizes of aircraft to stratospheric and space aircraft and rockets. The images on this slide are from various aerospace companies who are based here in Aotearoa or that are launching from here. The majority are for civilian, not military purposes, and one of these companies, X-Craft, which makes robotic air and sea craft, which is in the lower two images on the right side of the screen, has specifically ruled out any military involvement in their products, something we'd like to encourage all the rest of them to do. Anyway, so some of the aerospace activity through all these levels from low altitude to space is beneficial to humanity, but military activity is not. And I'm going to focus in this presentation on two areas. One is space, so this is in relation to New Zealand's policy, and the other is in relation to airborne autonomous weapon systems. So our position on space can be summarised by these three tags: keep space for peace, no weapons in space, and no militarisation of space. These are based on three areas, which I'll briefly explain in relation to New Zealand's commitments. So firstly, the peaceful use of space. New Zealand has stated its commitment to peaceful uses of space frequently. So this commitment is both general as a member of the international community and specifically as a member of the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space since 2016. Secondly, New Zealand's disarmament, humanitarian law and human rights obligations through domestic legislation and international conventions both prohibit a range of weapons, including nuclear, biological and chemical weapons, as well as cluster munitions, landmines and other weapons with inhumane and indiscriminate effects. And there are two obligations related to this. One is not to permit the launch of any of those weapons, and obviously not to have any New Zealand companies involved in their production or deployment. And secondly, not to permit the launch of command, control, communications or guidance systems that would be used to launch prohibited weapons. New Zealand also has positive binding obligations around humanitarian law, not to support or assist prohibited military activity or war crimes, and the same around human rights. Thirdly, New Zealand's disarmament policy. This includes a commitment to, and I quote, show leadership in the development of new rules, norms and standards around the use of outer space, or I might say something that they're failing dismally at, as we'll get to in a minute. Secondly, a commitment to, and I quote, new international law to ban and regulate autonomous weapon systems, also known as killer robots. And it has also recently joined the International Declaration on Strengthening the Protection of Civilians from the Humanitarian Consequences arising from the use of explosive weapons in populated areas, which, as that very long title suggests, seeks to limit the use and thus the impact of explosive weapons in populated areas. So, as I'm sure most of you, if not all of you know, last year MB ran a consultation process around New Zealand's aerospace strategy, during which we and others raised our concerns as previously outlined. So they're the three that I've just mentioned. Yeah. During the consultation, MB said that the aerospace strategy did not need to specify New Zealand's disarmament and other obligations and commitments because that would be covered in the space policy, which we'll get to in a moment. Sure enough, when the strategy was released in July, there was no reference to disarmament and only one reference to peace, as in New Zealand is a signatory to NASA's Artemis Accord to support peaceful exploration and activity in space. The aerospace strategy also included worrying statements about the MOD and New Zealand Armed Forces, which I'll cover under the space policy. So the space policy consultation ran at the same time, also run by MB, so the aerospace and the space policy, were running at the same time, and the same concerns were raised by ourselves and others, including the Public Advisory Committee on Disarmament and Arms Control, which I'm actually on, but I'm not speaking on behalf of today. That is the statutory body established by the 1987 New Zealand Nuclear Free Zone Disarmament and Arms Control Act, which includes statutory provisions around a number of different weapon systems. So lo and behold, as with the aerospace strategy, the policy released at the end of May by MB was a tragic disappointment. It was released in the same week as the UN Secretary General's For All Humanity, The Future of Outer Space Governance, Our Common Agenda policy brief, which includes a section on the prevention of conflict in outer space, which points out that additional normative frameworks are needed to prevent any extension of armed conflict into outer space and to prevent the weaponisation of outer space. If only New Zealand's policy said the same. So by contrast, the New Zealand space policy has only 4 references to a peaceful space environment and mentions partnering with like-minded launch states to adopt peaceful, responsible and sustainable space practices. But despite MB's assurances during the aerospace strategy consultation, it has no reference at all to disarmament, to arms control, conflict prevention, or to preventing the militarisation of space. Even worse, there is a section each for the MOD and NZDF, which refer to, and I quote, engagements with strategic defence partners and close cooperation with partner militaries, respectively. And as we all know, one of those partners is in particular actively engaged in further developing their national security strategies, doctrines, concepts and policies, and describing space as a, quote, warfighting and operational domain. So much for partnering with like-minded launch states to adopt peaceful, responsible and sustainable space practices. Also on that point, there's the Combined Space Operations Group, which New Zealand joined in July 2015, and this was the first meeting that was held in Aotearoa. This is a military space initiative, and its purpose is to share information about space operations and activities and coordinate efforts to ensure, and I quote, space remains a secure, stable, safe, peaceful and operationally sustainable domain for all. I mean, seriously, under military command and control. I mean, that about sums it up, really. Now, funnily enough, there is one slight positive thing. As the aerospace and space consultations were going on, New Zealand's export control regime also was going through a consultation process. This has actually been in several stages, but at the same time as the MB consultations, MFAT was doing this. And I've included this in here because it specifies New Zealand's obligations, right? You can see that on the slide there. And in fact, it details all of the disarmament legislation and more. So it details all of New Zealand's obligations and commitments. And so this is just to prove that it actually is possible for these things to be included in government policy if there is the will to do so. Okay, so to move to the second part of the aerospace industry that I'm going to focus on, which is autonomous weapon systems, or killer robots as they are generally referred to. Killer robots are weapon systems that are designed to select targets and attack independently without any meaningful level of human control. So essentially death by algorithm is what we call it. New Zealand launched its killer robots policy in November 2021, which, while stronger than some other states' positions, nevertheless has 2 major flaws. The first is that the key ethical issue around killer robots, which is that life and death decisions must not be operated to machines operating independently on lines of digital code, is not included in the policy as something that must be prohibited. In fact, it was deliberately left out of the policy. The second flaw is that it does not include the development of national legislation, which again, the government has repeatedly refused to support. It says until after international agreement is reached. So that has, at the international level, negotiations have been going on since 2013. So that may take years, if ever, to actually achieve that, right? So in the absence of national legislation, New Zealand robotics and AI companies and researchers may become involved in the development of autonomous weapon systems, and then that in turn would undermine the possibility of future legislation because of the so-called economic benefits. And so that brings me to the final point in this presentation around our concerns. Sorry, these aren't all of our concerns. I just tried to highlight 3 key areas because there are just so many, right? So this is the final point about our concerns around the developing aerospace industry. Australia, as I'm sure you all know, and in fact Robert mentioned this as well, is currently engaged in a massive militarisation push, which includes US military aerospace companies partnering with Australian companies. So this is one example, the Ghost Bat, an uncrewed teaming aircraft designed to be a force multiplier in support of advanced multi-mission air combat operations, which is the first military aircraft to be designed, manufactured and flown in Australia for more than 50 years. But Australian companies are also involved in this militarisation push as part of AUKUS Pillar 2. Sorry, and it's not only Australian companies, it's also universities and researchers. I mean, it's infected the whole of Australian society. And this is all to do with AUKUS Pillar 2, which is, of course, one of the many reasons we don't want New Zealand to join it. So this is Defentex, which is this company, have developed they call them Drone 40 loitering munitions, which are designed to destroy tanks, manpower, and ammunition depots, which it is currently supplying to Ukraine. And you can see the little image of it. It's all sort of folded in, and then it's fired from whatever it's fired from a range of different weapon systems, and then off it goes and then blows things up. But Defentex is also developing swarm technology, whereby artificial intelligence will be used to coordinate swarms of combat drones. So in the absence of any New Zealand legislation around autonomous weapon systems, this is the sort of development that New Zealand companies and researchers may very well get involved in. So to conclude, as we said, when the latest tragic New Zealand military policy review documents were released earlier this month, New Zealand has a choice around all of this. It doesn't have to keep the same old short-sighted, outdated and narrow notions of military security. It could refuse to be involved in further militarisation and instead put resources into real human security. Security that promotes human health and well-being, flourishing communities, food security, social justice, climate action and climate justice, protection of the natural environment and biodiversity, and care for the planet. There are so many things that New Zealand could be focused on and putting resources into rather than ever increasing militarisation and ongoing involvement in the global cycle of violence. Thank you.
Right, kia ora, Edwina. Really appreciate that very comprehensive proposal, and I know that certainly from your perspective, you didn't touch on many of the key issues for the peace movement, but I think that that is a really nice setup, the kind of broad brush ecological and peace concerns about the development of a homegrown aerospace industry, and it gives a great lead